The Metamorphosis of Freedom. Sigmund Freud. The Metamorphosis of Freedom. With the advent of puberty are introduced the changes that bring the infantile sexual life to its final normal conformation. The sexual drive was until then predominantly autoerotic, now find the sexual object. Until that moment, I had acted on the basis of singular erogenous drives and zones that, independently of each other, sought a certain pleasure as the only sexual goal. Now she is given a new sexual goal. To achieve it, all the partial drives cooperate, while the erogenous zones are subordinated to the primacy of the genital zone. Since the new sexual goal assigns very different functions to the two sexes, their sexual development is henceforth widely separated. The man's is the most consistent, and also the most accessible to our understanding, while in the woman there is even a kind of involution. The normality of sexual life is guaranteed only by the exact coincidence of the two currents directed to the sexual object and goal, the tender and the sensual. The first of them gathers in itself what remains of the early childhood flowering of sexuality. 3. It is like the drilling of a tunnel from both ends. The new sexual goal consists for the male in the discharge of the genetic products. In no way is it alien to the previous one, to the achievement of pleasure. Rather, to this final act of the sexual process is attached the maximum amount of pleasure. The sexual drive is now put at the service of the reproduction function. It becomes, so to speak, altruistic. In order for this transmutation to be successfully achieved, it is necessary to have the original dispositions and all the peculiarities of the drives. As in all other cases in which new connections and new compositions in complex mechanisms must be produced in the organism, here too pathological disturbances can occur by interruption of these rearrangements. All pathological disturbances of sexual life are rightly to be regarded as developmental inhibitions. The primacy of the genital areas and prior pleasure. We see very clearly the starting point and the final goal of the course of development that we have just described. Mediating transitions are still obscure to us in many respects. We will have to allow more than one enigma to subsist in them. The most striking thing that they present has been chosen as the essential of the processes of puberty, the manifest growth of the external genitalia, which during the latency period of childhood had shown a relative inhibition. At the same time, the development of the internal genitalia has advanced to the point of being able to offer genetic products, or to receive them, for the gestation of a new being. Thus an extremely complicated apparatus has been ready, which awaits the moment when it will have to be used. This apparatus must be set in motion by means of stimuli. In relation to this, observation teaches us that stimuli can reach it in 3 ways: from the outside world, by excitation of the erogenous zones that we already know; from within the organism, following paths that still need to be investigated; and from the psychic life, which in turn constitutes a repository of external impressions and a receptor of internal excitations. The same thing is provoked by all 3 paths, a state that is defined as sexual arousal and is revealed by 2 kinds of signs, psychic and somatic. The psychic sign consists of a peculiar feeling of tension, of an extremely strenuous character. Among the multiple bodily signs, a series of alterations in the genitals stands out in the first place, which have an indubitable meaning: the preparation for the sexual act, the erection of the male member, the moistening of the vagina, the sexual tension. The state of sexual arousal thus presents the character of a tension. With this a problem is threaded whose solution is as difficult as it would be important to understand sexual problems. Despite the difference of opinion that prevails on this point in psychology, I must maintain that a feeling of tension must carry the character of displeasure. What is decisive for me is that a feeling of this kind entails the effort to alter the psychic situation. It operates instinctually, which is completely foreign to the nature of felt pleasure. But if the tension of the state of sexual arousal is counted among the feelings of displeasure, it comes up against the fact that it is unequivocally experienced as pleasurable. The tension produced by sexual processes is always accompanied by pleasure. Even in the preparatory alterations of the genitals a kind of feeling of satisfaction can be recognized. Now how do this unpleasant tension and this feeling of pleasure fit together? Everything concerning the problem of pleasure and displeasure touches one of the thorniest points of current psychology. We will try to learn as much as possible from the conditions of the case at hand, and avoid taking a narrower approach to the problem as a whole. Let's first take a look at how the erogenous zones fit into the new order. An important role falls on them in the introduction of sexual arousal. The eye, which is perhaps the furthest from the sexual object, can almost always be stimulated reason, in the courtship situation of the object, by that particular quality of arousal whose arouser in the sexual object we call beauty. Hence, the excellences of the sexual object are called charms reis. Point 6. With this excitement is already connected, on the one hand, a pleasure, on the other, it has the consequence of increasing the state of sexual arousal, or provoking it when it is still lacking. If the excitement of another erogenous zone is added, for example that of the hand that touches, the effect is the same, a sensation of pleasure that is soon reinforced with that which comes from the preparatory alterations of the genitals, for a hand, and, on the other, an increase in sexual tension that soon turns into the clearest displeasure if he is not allowed to seek further pleasure. Perhaps this other case is even more transparent, that of a person who is not sexually aroused who is stimulated by an erogenous zone by contact, such as the skin of a woman's chest. This contact already causes a feeling of pleasure, but at the same time it is apt, like nothing else, to arouse sexual arousal that demands more pleasure. How does the pleasure felt arouse the need for a greater pleasure? Here, precisely, is the problem. Mechanism of prior pleasure. Now, the role that erogenous zones play in this process is clear. What goes for one goes for all. As a whole they are applied to provide, through their adequate stimulation, a certain amount of pleasure. From this starts the increase in tension, which, in turn, has to offer the motor energy necessary to bring the sexual act to its conclusion. The penultimate piece of this act is, once again, the appropriate stimulation of an erogenous zone, the genital zone itself in the glans penis, by the most apt object for it, the vaginal mucosa, and under the pleasure that this excitation procures, the motor energy required for the expulsion of the genetic substances is gained, this time through reflex. This last pleasure is the maximum for its intensity, and different from the previous ones for its mechanism. It is caused entirely by discharge, is wholly a satisfying pleasure, and with it the tension of the libido is temporarily relieved. It does not seem unjustified to fix by a name this difference in nature between the pleasure caused by the excitation of erogenous zones and that produced by the emptying of sexual substances. The first can conveniently be designated as forepleasure, as opposed to final pleasure or satisfaction pleasure from sexual activity. The previous pleasure is, then, the same thing that the infantile sexual drive could already offer, although on a reduced scale. The final pleasure is new, and therefore probably depends on conditions that only set in with puberty. The formula for the new function of the erogenous zones would be, they are used to make possible, through the previous pleasure that they gain as in childhood, the production of the pleasure of greater satisfaction. I was recently able to elucidate another example, taken from an entirely different field of mental events, in which a greater pleasure effect is likewise achieved by virtue of a less pleasurable sensation, thus operating as an incentive bonus. There was also an opportunity to take a closer look at the nature of pleasure. Dangers of foregoing pleasure. Now, the connection of prior pleasure with infantile sexual life is credited for the pathogenic role that it may correspond to. From the mechanism in which forepleasure is included obviously derives a danger to the achievement of the normal sexual goal. This danger arises when, at any point in the preparatory sexual processes, forepleasure proves to be too great, and too little. Its contribution to the stress. The drive force is then lacking for the sexual process to continue, the whole path is shortened, and the corresponding preparatory action replaces the normal sexual goal. Experience tells us that this damage is conditioned by the fact that the respective erogenous zone, or the corresponding partial drive, has already contributed to the gain of pleasure to an unusual extent in childhood. And if factors that contribute to fixation are added, a refractory compulsion is easily engendered for this particular previous pleasure to be integrated into a new plot in later life. Of this kind is, in effect, the mechanism of many perversions, which consist in a delay in preparatory acts of the sexual process. Failure of the function of the sexual mechanism due to prior pleasure is avoided, above all, when already in childhood the primacy of the genital zones is prefigured in some way. The devices for it seem to be really present in the second half of childhood, from 8 years to puberty. In those years, the genital areas already behave in a similar way to the time of maturity. They become the seat of sensations of excitement and preparatory disturbances when some kind of pleasure is felt from the satisfaction of other erogenous zones. This effect, however, remains without purpose, that is, it contributes nothing to the continuation of the sexual process. For this reason, already in childhood, together with the pleasure of satisfaction, a certain amount of sexual tension is engendered, although less constant and not so vast. And now we understand why, when elucidating the sources of sexuality, we could just as well say that the respective process caused sexual satisfaction or sexual arousal. Now we notice that, in our cognitive way, at the beginning we conceive exaggeratedly great the differences between infantile and mature sexual life, so let's amend the above. Infantile externalizations of sexuality not only mark the fate of deviations from normal sexual life, but also that of its normal conformation. The problem of sexual arousal. We have remained completely unclear both the origin and the nature of the sexual tension that, as a result of the satisfaction of erogenous zones, is engendered at the same time as pleasure. The most obvious conjecture, namely that this tension results somehow from the pleasure itself, is not only itself highly improbable, it is invalidated by the fact that the maximum pleasure, the one linked to the expulsion of the genetic products, does not produce any tension. On the contrary, it removes all tension. Therefore, pleasure and sexual tension can only be related indirectly. Role of sexual substances. Besides the fact that normally only the discharge of sexual substances puts an end to sexual arousal, we have still other grounds for linking sexual tension with sexual products. When a continent life is led, the genetic apparatus usually discharges its materials at night in variable periods, but not without any rule. This occurs with the sensation of pleasure and during the dream hallucination of a sexual act. In view of this process, nocturnal emission, it seems difficult not to understand sexual tension, which knows how to find the hallucinatory shortcut in substitution of the act, as a function of the accumulation of semen in the reservoir for the genetic products. The experiences that are made about the exhaustion of the sexual mechanism speak in the same sense. When the semen reserve is empty, not only is the execution of the sexual act impossible, the stimulability of the erogenous zones also fails, whose excitation, however appropriate, is no longer capable of provoking any pleasure. In passing, we learn that a certain measure of sexual tension is indispensable even for the excitability of such areas. Thus we are led to a hypothesis that, if I am not mistaken, is quite widespread. The accumulation of sexual materials creates and sustains sexual tension. This is perhaps due to the fact that the pressure of these products on the wall of their receptacles has the effect of stimulating a spinal center. The state of this is perceived by a higher center, thus generating for the consciousness the well-known sensation of tension. If the excitement of erogenous zones increases sexual tension, this can only be because they have a prefigured anatomical connection with those centers. They raise the very tone of excitement and, when the tension is sufficient, they start the sexual act, but when it is not, they encourage the production of the genetic substances. The weak points of this doctrine, which we find, for example, in Krafft-Ebing's exposition of the sexual processes, reside in the following: created to explain the reproductive activity of the mature man, it takes little account of three situations whose clarification should be toast at the same time. They are the situations of children, women, and castrated men. In none of these three cases can one speak of an accumulation of gene products in the same sense as in man, which hinders the smooth application of the scheme. However, it must be admitted without further ado that it would be possible to find certain expedients in order to subordinate these cases to him as well. In any case, the warning remains that we should not attribute to the accumulation of gene products operations that it does not seem capable of. Appreciation of the internal sexual parts. Observations of castrated males seem to corroborate that sexual arousal is, to a remarkable degree, independent of the production of genetic substances. Although the rule is that the operation impairs your libido, and that is the reason for which it was performed, sometimes it does not happen. On the other hand, it has long been known that diseases that wiped out the production of male reproductive cells left the now sterile individual's libido and potency intact. For this reason it is by no means as surprising as C. Rieger 1900 supposes that the loss of the male reproductive glands in maturity may not have a major influence on the individual's mental behavior. It is true that castration practiced at an early age, before puberty, approaches in its effect the goal of suppressing the sexual characteristics, but in such a case, in addition to the loss of the reproductive glands themselves, it could also be that the inhibition of development of other factors associated with that loss came into account. Chemical theory. Experiments made with the extirpation of the reproductive glands, testicles and ovaries, in animals, and the alternative implantation of such organs in vertebrates, have at last thrown a partial light on the origin of sexual arousal and pushed it to an even more secondary plane. The supposed importance of an accumulation of gene cell products. The experiment, Stinich, of molting a male into a female and, conversely, a female into a male, has become possible, in the process of which the psychosexual behavior of the animal it varies according to and together with the somatic reproductive characteristics. Now, this determining influence in the sexual thing should not be attributed to the contribution of the reproductive glands that produce the specific cells, spermatozoa and ovum, but to their interstitial tissues, which for this reason, the authors have singled them out under the name pubertal glands. It is quite possible that further research will reveal that the pubertal glands are normally androgynous in disposition, which would give an anatomical foundation to the doctrine of bisexuality. The higher animals. And of course it is likely that they are not the only organ involved in arousal and sexual characteristics. Either way, this new biological discovery adds to what we've already learned about the role of the thyroid in sexuality. We are authorized to think that certain chemical substances are produced in the interstitial sector of the reproductive glands which, collected by the blood flow, charge certain sectors of the central nervous system with sexual tension. In the case of poisonous substances introduced into the body from outside, we already know such a transposition of a toxic stimulus into a particular organ stimulus. Regarding the way in which sexual arousal is generated by stimulation of erogenous zones, after charging the central apparatus, and the combinations between the effects of purely toxic and physiological stimuli, which are produced as a result of these sexual processes, such problems can only be treated by way of hypothesis, and this is not the place to deal with them. It is enough for us to establish, as the essential of this conception of sexual processes, the hypothesis that there are particular substances that come from sexual metabolism. Point 12. Indeed, this thesis, apparently arbitrary, is supported by an insight little taken into account, but worthy of the most attention. The neuroses that can be traced back to disturbances of the sexual life show the greatest clinical resemblance to the phenomena of intoxication and withdrawal as a result of the habitual consumption of toxic substances that produce pleasure, alkaloids. In its present form, the entire paragraph up to this point dates from 1920. In the first, 1905, and two subsequent editions, the following appeared in its place: the truth is that we cannot report anything about the nature of sexual arousal, especially since we do not know to which organ or organs sexuality is linked, since we realize that we have overestimated the importance of the sexual glands. After surprising discoveries have shown us the important role of the thyroid in sexuality, we are entitled to assume that the knowledge of the essential factors of the latter is still a thing of the future. Whoever experiences the need to fill this great gap in our knowledge by means of some provisional hypothesis, can form the following picture, relying on the effective substances that have been discovered in the thyroid, by appropriate stimulation of erogenous zones, as well as in other situations in which a sexual coexcitation is born, a substance disseminated throughout the organism decomposes, and the products of its decomposition provide a specific stimulus to the organs of reproduction or to the spinal center linked to them. We already know, in the case of other substances, poisons introduced into the body as something foreign, such a transposition of a toxic stimulus into a particular organ stimulus. It is not yet time to hypothesize the combinations between the effects of purely toxic and physiological stimuli, which are produced as a result of sexual processes. For the rest, I do not assign any value to the proposed hypothesis, and I would be ready to abandon it at once in favor of some other, as long as it retained its fundamental character, the insistence on sexual chemism. It is worth noting how few modifications had to be made to Freud's hypothesis due to the discovery of sexual hormones, which in reality he had anticipated not in 1905 but at least in 1896, as can be verified in his letters to Fliess of March 19 and on April 2 of said year. He re-emphasized the importance of chemism in his second paper on the role of sexuality in the neuroses, published more or less simultaneously with the first edition of the 3 essays. See also his comments on the matter in On Female Sexuality. The libido theory. The auxiliary representations that we have formed with a view to mastering the psychic externalizations of sexual life correspond very well with the previous conjectures about the chemical basis of sexual arousal. We have established the concept of libido as a force susceptible to quantitative variations, which could measure processes and transformations in the field of sexual arousal. In relation to its particular origin, we differentiate it from the energy that must be assumed to be the basis of mental processes in general, and thus we also confer a qualitative character on it. By separating libidinal energy from other kinds of psychic energy, we give expression to the premise that the sexual processes of the organism differ from the processes of nutrition by a particular chemistry. The analysis of perversions and psychoneuroses has allowed us to understand that this sexual excitement is not provided only by the so-called reproductive parts, but by all the organs of the body. Thus we arrive at the representation of a quantum of libido whose psychic subrogation we call ego libido, its production, its increase or decrease, its distribution and displacement, are intended to offer us the possibility of explaining the observed psychosexual phenomena. Now, this ego libido only becomes comfortably accessible to analytic study when it has found psychic use in the cathexis of sexual objects, that is to say, when it has become object libido. We see her concentrating on objects, fixing herself on them or abandoning them, moving from one to the other and, from these positions, guiding the sexual activity of the individual, which leads to satisfaction, that is, to the partial and temporary extinction of the libido. The psychoanalysis of the so-called transference neuroses, hysteria and obsessional neurosis, provides us with a certain vision of this. In addition, we can know, as regards the destinations of the object libido, that it is withdrawn from objects, remains fluctuating in particular states of tension and, finally, is collected within the ego, whereupon it becomes new to libido yoica. The latter, as opposed to the object libido, we also call the narcissistic libido. From psychoanalysis we glimpse, as if over a barrier that we are not allowed to cross, inside the factory of the narcissistic libido, this is how we form a representation about the relationship between the two. The narcissistic libido or ego libido appears to us as the great reservoir from which object cathexes are emitted and to which they withdraw again, and the narcissistic libidinal cathexis of the ego, as the original state realized in early childhood, which is only concealed by the later outpourings of the libido, but is preserved in the background behind them. A theory of the libido in the field of neurotic and psychotic disturbances would have the task of expressing all observed phenomena and discovered processes in terms of the libidinal economy. It is easy to deduce that the destinations of the ego libido have the greatest importance in this regard, in particular when it comes to explaining the deepest psychotic disturbances. The difficulty resides, then, in the fact that the medium of our investigation, psychoanalysis, has so far only provided us with certain information about the changes in the object libido 16, but it could not clearly separate the ego libido from the other energies that operate within the ego. For this reason, a continuation of the theory of the libido is only possible, provisionally, speculatively. However, everything gained so far thanks to psychoanalytic observation is renounced when, following C.G. Jung, the concept of libido is dissolved, making it coincide with that of a psychic drive force in general. The separation between the sexual instinctual movements and the others, and consequently the restriction of the concept of libido to the first, finds strong support in the hypothesis, already considered here, of a particular chemistry of the sexual function. Differentiation between man and woman. As is known, only with puberty is the sharp separation between the masculine and feminine character established, an opposition that later influences the vital fabric of human beings more decisively than any other. It is true that already in childhood masculine and feminine dispositions are recognizable. The development of the inhibitions of sexuality, shame, disgust, compassion, is fulfilled in the little girl before and with less resistance than in the boy. In general, the inclination to sexual repression seems greater in her. Whenever partial drives of sexuality are clearly insinuated, they preferably adopt the passive form. But the autoerotic activation of the erogenous zones is the same in both sexes, and this similarity precludes in childhood the possibility of a difference between the sexes of the kind that develops after puberty. With respect to autoerotic and masturbatory sexual manifestations, this thesis could be formulated: the sexuality of the little girl has an entirely masculine character. Even more, if we knew how to give a more precise content to the concepts of masculine and feminine, one could also defend the assertion that the libido is regularly, and in accordance with the law, of a masculine nature, whether it occurs in a man or a woman, regardless of whether its object is a man or a woman. It is essential to make it clear that the concepts of masculine and feminine, which seem so unequivocal to current opinion, are among the most confusing in science and must be broken down in at least three directions. They are used in the sense of activity and passivity, or in the biological sense, or in the sociological one. The first of these three meanings is the essential one, and the one that is almost always applied in psychoanalysis. That is why in the text the libido is defined as active, since the drive is always so, even in cases where a passive goal has been set. The second meaning, biological, is the one that admits the clearest definition. Here, masculine and feminine are characterized by the presence of semen or ovum, respectively, and by the functions derived from them. The activity and its collateral externalizations, greater muscular development, aggression, greater intensity of the libido, tend, in general, to go hand in hand with biological virility, but it is not a necessary link, since there are animal species in which these properties correspond rather to the female. The third meaning, the sociological one, gains content from the observation of the masculine and feminine individuals existing in reality. This observation shows that in the case of human beings we do not find pure masculinity or femininity in a psychological or biological sense. Rather, every individual exhibits a mixture of his biological sexual character with biological traits of the other sex, as well as a union of activity and passivity, both to the extent that these psychic character traits depend on the biological ones, and to the extent that which are independent of them. Since I have familiarized myself with the point of view of bisexuality, I consider that it is the decisive factor in this aspect, and that without taking it into account it will be difficult to understand the sexual manifestations of men and women as offered by observation. Of the facts governing zones in men and women. Apart from the above, I can only add this: in girls, the ruling erogenous zone is undoubtedly located in the clitoris, and is therefore homologous to the male genital zone, the glans. All that I have been able to learn from experience about masturbation in little girls concern the clitoris and not those parts of the external genitalia which later become relevant to reproductive functions. And I still doubt that the influence of seduction can provoke in the girl anything other than masturbation of the clitoris, otherwise it would be totally exceptional. The spontaneous discharges of the state of sexual arousal, so common precisely in the little girl, are expressed in contractions of the clitoris, and the frequent erections of this enable the girl to judge correctly about the male's sexual manifestations, even without being instructed in them. She simply transfers the sensations of her own sexual processes to him. If one wants to understand the process by which the girl becomes a woman, it is necessary to pursue the further destinations of this excitability of the clitoris. Puberty, which in the male brings with it that great drive of the libido, is characterized for the girl by a new wave of repression, which affects precisely the sexuality of the clitoris. It is a sector of male sexual life that thus falls under repression. The reinforcement of sexual inhibitions, created by this repression that comes upon the woman at puberty, then provides a stimulus to the man's libido, which is forced to intensify its operations, and together with the height of his libido his sexual overestimation increases, which in its full measure is only valid for the woman who refuses, who denies her sexuality. And later, when the sexual act is finally permitted, the clitoris itself is aroused, and the role of relaying that arousal to the neighboring female parts falls upon it, just as a bundle of resinous twigs can be used to ignite a burning log. Further, difficult. Often a certain amount of time is required for that transfer to take place. During that time the young woman is anesthetic. This anesthesia can be long-lasting when the clitoral area refuses to give up its excitability. Intense activation in childhood predisposes to it. As is well known, women's anesthesia is often only apparent, local. They are anesthetic in the vagina, but by no means unexcitable from the clitoris or even from other areas. And then, to these erogenous occasions of anesthesia are added the psychic ones, also conditioned by repression. Every time that she manages to transfer the erogenous stimulability of the clitoris to the vagina, the woman has changed the governing zone for her subsequent sexual practice. Instead, man keeps it from childhood. In this change of the ruling erogenous zone, as well as in the repressive surge of puberty which, so to speak, eliminates infantile virility, lie the main conditions of the woman's proclivity to neurosis, in particular to hysteria. These conditions are intertwined then, and in the most intimate way, with the nature of femininity. Object finding. During the processes of puberty, the primacy of the genital areas is affirmed, and in the male, the impetus of the erect member imperiously refers to the new sexual meat, penetrating a body cavity that excites the genital area. At the same time, from the psychic side, the finding of an object, prepared from the earliest childhood, is consummated. When the very first sexual satisfaction was still connected with nutrition, the sexual drive had an object outside of one's own body, the maternal breast. He lost it only later, perhaps just at the time when the child was able to form the global representation of the person to whom the organ that gave him satisfaction belonged. Afterwards, the sexual drive regularly becomes autoerotic, and only after the latency period is over is the original relationship re-established. Not without good foundation, the fact of suckling the child from its mother's breast becomes paradigmatic for all love bonds. The finding encounter of an object is properly a rencounter. Sexual object of the lactation period. But of these sexual relations, the first and most important of all, there remains, even after sexual activity has been divorced from nutrition, a considerable part, which helps to prepare the choice of object and thus to restore bliss. Loss. Throughout the latency period, the child learns to love other people who remedy his helplessness and meet his needs. He does so by following the model of his infant bonds with the wet nurse, and continuing them. Perhaps you do not want to identify with sexual love the feelings of tenderness and appreciation that the child encourages towards the people who care for him, but I am of the opinion that a more precise psychological inquiry will establish that identity beyond any doubt. The child's relationship with the person who takes care of him is for him a continuous source of sexual excitement and satisfaction from the erogenous zones, and all the more so because that person as a rule, the mother directs over the feelings that flow from his sexual life, caresses him, kisses him and rocks him, and clearly takes him as a substitute for a full-fledged sexual object. Point 23. The mother would probably be horrified if it were made clear to her that with all her displays of tenderness awakens your child's sexual drive and prepares its subsequent intensity. He judges his behavior as a pure love, asexual, and even carefully avoids bringing more excitement to the child's genitals than those essential for the care of the body. But we already know that the sexual drive is not awakened only by excitation of the genital area. What we call tenderness will inevitably exert its effect one day also on the genital areas. Now then, if the mother knew better the great importance that the drives have for all mental life, for all ethical and psychic achievements, she would spare herself self-reproach even after this clarification. When he teaches the child to love, he is only fulfilling his mission. It is that he must become a man of integrity, endowed with an energetic sexual need, and consummate in his life everything towards which the drive pushes human beings. Undoubtedly, an excess of tenderness on the part of the parents will be harmful, since it will hasten their sexual maturation, and also it will spoil the child, make it unable to temporarily renounce love in later life, or be content with a lesser degree of it. One of the best predictors of later neurosis is that the child is insatiable in his demand for tenderness from his parents, and, on the other hand, it is almost always neuropathic parents who are inclined to show excessive tenderness, and contribute to a remarkable degree by their pampering to awaken the disposition of the child to contract a neurosis. For the rest, this example makes us see that neurotic parents have more direct paths than inheritance to transfer their disturbance to their children. Child anguish. Children themselves behave early on as if their attachment to their caregivers is of the nature of sexual love. Children's anguish is originally nothing more than the expression of their longing for the person they love. That is why they respond to every stranger with anguish. They are afraid of the dark because in it the loved one cannot be seen, and they allow themselves to be calmed down if they can hold their hand. The effect of all the scarecrows and all the gruesome tales of nursemaids is overestimated when they are blamed for producing that state of anxiety. Only children who tend to the state of anguish collect such stories, which will not make a dent in others, and only children with a hypertrophic or prematurely developed sexual drive, or aroused by excessive pampering, tend to the state of anguish. In this the child behaves like the adult. As soon as he cannot satisfy his libido, he changes it into anguish, and conversely, the adult, when he has become neurotic due to an unsatisfied libido, behaves in his anguish like a child. He will begin to be afraid as soon as he is left alone, that is to say, without a person whose love he believes he is sure of, and to want to appease his anguish with the most puerile measures. The incest barrier: when the tenderness that the parents show to the child has avoided awakening the sexual drive prematurely, that is to say, before the bodily conditions typical of puberty are given, and awakening it with such force that the psychic excitation is open the way unequivocally to the genital system, that drive can fulfill its mission, lead this child, reached maturity, to the choice of the sexual object. Certainly, the most immediate thing for the child would be to choose as sexual objects precisely the people whom he has loved since childhood, so to speak, with a dampened libido. 6. But, by virtue of the delay in sexual maturation, he has gained time to erect, together with other sexual inhibitions, the barrier of incest, and to implant in it the moral precepts that expressly exclude from the choice of object, because of their quality of blood relatives, the people loved from childhood. This barrier is above all a cultural requirement of society. It has to prevent the family from absorbing interests that it needs to establish superior social units, and for this reason in all individuals, but especially in adolescent boys, it takes hold of all the resources to loosen the ties they maintain with their family, the only decisive ones in childhood. Room where they had locked him up in the dark. Auntie, talk to me, I am afraid because it is very dark. And the aunt who blurts out, what do you gain with that? You can't see me anyway. To which the boy replied, it doesn't matter, there is more light when someone speaks. Therefore, he was not afraid of the dark except for the fact that he missed a dear person, and he could promise to calm down as soon as he received proof of his presence. Added in 1920, the fact that neurotic anxiety arises from the libido, is a product of its transmutation and maintains with it the relationship of vinegar to wine, is one of the most significant results of psychoanalytic research. For a further examination of this problem, see my introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, a lecture, although it must be confessed that the definitive clarification was not reached even there. The choice of object is consummated first in the sphere of representation, and it is difficult for the sexual life of the young man who matures to be able to unfold in another space of play than that of fantasies, that is, representations not destined to be executed. Asterisk. As a result of these fantasies they return to, in the various stages of their development, and the frequency with which they transgress it in their fantasies and even in reality. Although this is the first time that the horror of incest appears in a publication by Freud, he had already examined it on May 31, 1897, that is, a few months before he had his first revelation of the Oedipus complex. Also in that manuscript he gives a reason for it, citing as a foundation the fact that incest is antisocial. The fantasies of the puberty period continue the sexual investigation abandoned in childhood, although they also extend somewhat into the latency period. They may remain wholly or largely unconscious, and so often cannot be accurately dated. They are of great importance for the genesis of various symptoms, since they directly provide the previous stages of these, that is, they establish the ways in which the repressed libidinal components find their satisfaction. In the same way, they are the molds of the nocturnal fantasies that become conscious as dreams. The latter are often nothing other than revivals of such fantasies under the influence of a daytime stimulus that has remained pending wakefulness, and by being anchored in it, daytime rest. The interpretation of dreams. Among the sexual fantasies of the puberty period, some stand out for their universality and their considerable independence from what is experienced by the individual. Thus, the fantasies of spying with one's ears on the sexual intercourse of one's parents, of early seduction by loved ones, of the threat of castration. See the discussion of primordial fantasies at 23, of the Introductory Conferences on Psychoanalysis, 1916-17, those whose content is the permanence in the maternal womb and even the experiences that would be had there, and the so-called family novel, in which the adolescent reacts to the difference between his present attitude towards his parents and the one he had in childhood. Regarding this last example, Otto Rank, 1909, has shown the close links of these fantasies with myths. See also Freud's own work on the family novel of neurotics, 1909, and the case history of the Rat Man, 1909. It has been rightly said that the Oedipus complex is the nuclear complex of the neuroses, the essential piece of their content. In it culminates infantile sexuality, which, due to its consequences, decisively influences adult sexuality. To every human being, when he is born, he is given the task of mastering the Oedipus complex. The OU cannot solve it, it falls into neurosis. The progress of psychoanalytic work has emphasized in ever clearer lines this importance of the Oedipus complex. Its recognition has become the shibboleth that separates supporters of analysis from their opponents. Infantile inclinations emerge in all men, only now with a somatic reinforcement. And among these, in the first place, and with the frequency of a law, the sexual impulse of the child towards his parents, almost always already differentiated by the attraction of the opposite sex, that of the boy towards his mother and that of the girl towards her father. Point 29. Simultaneously with the subduing and dismissal of these clearly incestuous fantasies, one of the most important, but also most painful, psychic achievements of the puberty period is consummated, the detachment from the authority of the parents, the only one that creates the opposition, so important for the progress of culture, between the new generation and the old. A number of individuals lag behind in each of the stations of this path of development that everyone must go through. Thus, there are people who never surpassed the authority of their parents and did not withdraw their tenderness from them, or did so only in a very partial way. They are almost always girls, in such a way, to the satisfaction of their parents, they fully preserve their childhood love well beyond puberty. And it is very instructive to find that these girls, in their subsequent marriage, have broken the ability to offer their husbands what is due. They become cold wives and remain sexually anesthetic. This teaches that parental love, apparently non-sexual, and sexual love feed from the same sources, that is to say, the first corresponds only to an infantile fixation of the libido. The deeper disturbances of psychosexual development approach, the more unequivocally the importance of incestuous object choice becomes apparent. In psychoneurotics, much or all of the object-finding psychosexual activity remains unconscious. For girls who have an exaggerated need for tenderness, and an equally exaggerated horror of the real requirements of sexual life, it becomes an irresistible temptation, on the one hand, to realize in their lives the ideal of asexual love, and, on the other, hide their libido behind a tenderness that they can externalize without self-reproach, preserving throughout their lives the infantile inclination, renewed at puberty, towards parents or siblings. Psychoanalysis can demonstrate without work to these people who they are in love, in the ordinary sense of the term, with those blood relatives of theirs. He does it by investigating, with the help of symptoms and other pathological manifestations, his unconscious thoughts, and translating them into conscious thoughts. Also in those cases in which a person, previously healthy, becomes ill after suffering an unhappy love experience, it can be discovered with certainty, as a mechanism of his illness, the reversion of his libido to the favorite people of childhood. Subsequent effects of childhood choice of object. Even someone who has happily avoided the incestuous fixation of his libido does not completely escape its influence. The fact that the young man's first serious crush, as is so often, goes to a mature woman, and the girl's to an older man endowed with authority, is a clear echo of this phase of development. They can be revived. In fact, the image of the mother and the father trademark, perhaps the choice of object, in general, is produced through a freer underpinning in these models. The boy pursues, above all, the mnemonic image of the mother, such as governs him from the beginning of his childhood, and it is perfectly in harmony with this that the mother, still alive, revolts against this renewal of hers and shows her hostility. Given this importance of the infantile ties with the parents for the later choice of the sexual object, it is easy to understand that any disturbance of them brings about the most serious consequences for the adult sexual life. Not even the lover's jealousy lacks that infantile root or, at least, a reinforcement coming from the infantile. Disagreements between the parents, their unhappy married life, condition the most serious predisposition to a disturbed sexual development or to the contraction of a neurosis on the part of the children. The childhood inclination towards parents is undoubtedly the most important, but not the only one, of the paths that, renewed at puberty, later mark the path to the choice of an object. Other seeds of the same origin allow man, always propping himself up in his childhood, to develop more than one sexual series and to capture totally varied conditions for the choice of an object. Innumerable particularities of the love life of human beings, as well as the compulsive nature of falling in love itself, can only be understood by reference to childhood and as residual effects of it. Investment prevention. One of the tasks posed by the choice of object is not to mistake the opposite sex. As is known, it is not solved without some trial and error. Too often, the first motions that come after puberty are off the mark, although this does not cause permanent damage. Desoyer 1894 rightly noted the law that is revealed in the passionate friendships of adolescents, boys and girls, for those of the same sex. The great power that prevents a permanent reversal of the sexual object is undoubtedly the reciprocal attraction of opposite sexual characters. In the present context we cannot give any explanation about the latter. But that factor alone is not enough to exclude investment. A whole series of contributing factors are added. Above all, the authoritative inhibition of society, where investment is not considered a crime. It can be seen that it fully responds to the sexual inclinations of not a few individuals. In addition, in the case of the male, it can be assumed that his childhood memory of the tenderness of his mother and of other female persons on whom he depended as a child strongly contributes to directing his choice towards women, 33, and that, at the same time, the early sexual intimidation he experienced from his father, and his competitive attitude towards him, diverts him from his own sex. But both factors are also valid for the girl, whose sexual practice is under the particular supervision of the mother. The result is a hostile bond with the same sex, which has a decisive influence so that the choice of object is made in the sense considered normal. The education of males by persons of the male sex, slaves, in the ancient world, seems to favor homosexuality. The frequency of investment in the nobility today becomes perhaps a little more understandable if one considers the use of male servants, as well as the scant personal attention that mothers lavish on their children. In many hysterics, the early absence of one of the members of the parental couple, due to death, divorce, or reciprocal alienation, as a result of which the remaining member drew upon himself all the love of the child, turns out to be the condition that later fixes the sex of the person chosen as sexual object and, in this way, makes a permanent investment possible. Summary. The time has come to try a synthesis. We start from the aberrations of the sexual drive with reference to its object and its goal. We wonder if they arose as a result of an innate disposition or were acquired by the influences of life. We obtain the answer from the intellection of the circumstances surrounding the sexual drive in the case of psychoneurotics, a large group of human beings, not far from that of healthy ones. It was the psychoanalytic inquiry that gave us this insight. We found, then, that in these people the inclinations to all perversions were searchable as unconscious powers that showed through as symptom formers. We were able to affirm that neurosis is, in a way, a negative of perversion. We recognized then that perverse inclinations are widespread, and given that fact, this point of view was imposed on us. The disposition to perversions is the original and universal disposition of the sexual drive of human beings, and from it, as a consequence of organic alterations and psychic inhibitions, it develops in the course of maturation normal sexual behavior. We then encourage the hope of discovering that original disposition in childhood. Among the powers that circumscribe the orientation of the sexual drive, we highlight shame, disgust, compassion, and the social constructions of morality and authority. Thus, in everything that constitutes a fixed aberration with respect to normal sexual life, we could not help but discern a share of developmental inhibition and infantilism. We should have placed in the foreground the significance of the variations of the original disposition, but suppose between them and the influences of life a relationship of cooperation and not of rivalry. On the other hand, since the original disposition can only be complex, it seemed to us that the sexual drive itself was something made up of many factors, and that in the perversions, these were disintegrated, as it were, into their components. In this way, the perversions were evidenced on the one hand as inhibitions, and on the other as dissociations, of the development. Normal. Both conceptions were brought together in a hypothesis. The sexual drive of the adult engenders an aspiration with a single sexual goal through the composition of multiple motions of childhood life in a unit. And to this we still add the clarification of the preponderance of perverse inclinations in the case of psychoneurotics. We discern it as the collateral filling of some secondary channels as a result of a shift in the main channel, caused by repression. Having done this, we proceeded to consider the sexual life in childhood. Point 1. We found it regrettable that the existence of the sexual drive in childhood was denied, and that not infrequently manifestations of this nature observed in the child were described as exceptions to the rule. Rather, we consider that it brings the seeds of sexual activity with it into the world, and already in the act of ingesting food, it also enjoys a sexual satisfaction that later seeks to create itself, over and over again, in the well-known activity of sucking. But the child's sexual practice does not develop at the same pace as its other functions. Rather, after a brief period of flowering between the ages of 2 and 5,2 it enters the so-called latency period. In this, the production of sexual arousal is in no way suspended, but lasts and offers a store of energy that is mostly used for other purposes. Different sexual overtones, namely, on the one hand, to provide the sexual components of certain social feelings, and on the other, through repression and reaction formation, to build further sexual barriers. Thus, at the expense of the majority of the perverse sexual impulses, and with the help of education, the powers destined to maintain the sexual drive within certain paths would be built in childhood. Another part of infantile sexual impulses escapes these uses and can be externalized as a sexual practice. As we have argued, it can then be ascertained that the child's sexual arousal flows from various sources. Above all, the appropriate sensitive excitation of the so-called erogenous zones would produce satisfaction. Apparently, any part of the skin and any organ of the senses, and probably any organ, can act as such. However, there are certain privileged erogenous zones whose excitation would be ensured from the beginning by certain organic devices. In addition, one sexual excitation is generated, so to speak, as a secondary product, as a result of a great series of processes that take place in the organism, as soon as they reach a certain intensity, and in particular, the same occurs as a result of any intense movement of the mind, even if it is of a painful nature. The excitations coming from all these sources are not yet combined, but separately pursue their goal, which is none other than the gain of a certain pleasure. From this we infer, therefore, that in childhood the sexual drive is not centered and at first lacks an object, that is, it is autoerotic. Already in childhood the erogenous zone of the genitals begins to become noticeable, either because, like any other erogenous zone, it engenders satisfaction in the face of adequate sensitive stimulation, or because, in a way that we do not fully understand, the satisfaction obtained from other sources at the same time, it produces a sexual arousal that particularly affects the genital area. We have to regret that sufficient clarification of the links between sexual satisfaction and arousal, as well as between the activity of the genital area and that of the other sources of sexuality, cannot yet be achieved. The study of neurotic disturbances 5 has made us notice that in infantile sexual life, traces of an organization of sexual drive components can be discerned from the very beginning. In a first phase, very early, oral eroticism is in the foreground. A second of these pregenital organizations is characterized by the predominance of sadism and anal eroticism. Only in a third phase, which in the child develops only up to the primacy of the phallus, does sexual life come to be commanded by the participation of the genital zones proper. One of the most surprising findings was the one that led us to verify that this early flowering of infantile sexual life, from 2 to 5 years of age, also makes a choice of object mature, with all the rich psychic operations that this entails, and in such a way that the phase that is associated and corresponds to it, despite the lack of a synthesis of the singular drive components and the imprecision of the sexual goal, must be appreciated as an important precursor of the definitive sexual organization. The fact of the two-stage rush of sexual development in the human being, that is to say, its interruption by the latency period, seemed to us worthy of particular attention. This fact seems to contain one of the conditions of man's aptitude for the development of a superior culture, but also of his proclivity to neurosis. In man's animal lineage we cannot trace anything analogous. The genesis of this human property would have to be sought in the primordial history of the species. We were unable to determine the extent to which childhood sexual practices cease to be normal and become detrimental to later development. The character of the sexual expressions was revealed as predominantly masturbatory. In addition, the experience allowed us to verify that external influences such as seduction can cause premature intrusions into the latency period until it cancels it, and that in such cases the child's sexual drive is in fact accredited as perverse polymorphous. We also find out that any premature sexual activity of this kind hurts the child's ability to educate. Despite the gaps in our understanding of infantile sexual life, we were later led to attempt the study of the transformations that occur with the emergence of puberty. We highlight two as the decisive ones: the subordination of all the other original sources of sexual arousal under the primacy of the genital zones, and the process of finding an object. Both are already prefigured in childhood life. The first is consummated by the mechanism of taking advantage of previous pleasure, the other autonomous sexual acts, which are linked to pleasure and excitement, become preparatory acts for the new sexual goal, the emptying of the genetic products, and the achievement of this goal, under enormous pleasure, puts an end to sexual arousal. As a result of this, we had considered the differentiation of masculine and feminine sexuality, and we found that the latter requires a new repression that suppresses a sector of infantile virility and prepares the woman for the change of the ruling genital area. Finally, we find that the choice of object is guided by infantile signs, renewed at puberty, of the child's sexual inclination towards his parents and caregivers. Take care of it, and, diverted from these people by the barrier of incest erected in the meantime, it turns towards others similar to them. Let us add, finally, that during the transition period constituted by puberty, the somatic and psychic development processes proceed for a time without coming into contact with each other, until an intense psychic impulse of love breaks out which, innervating the genitals, produces the unity of the love function that normality requires. Factors that disturb development. As we elucidate in various examples, every step on this long path of development can become a place of fixation, and every point of articulation of this complicated synthesis, on the occasion of a dissociative process of the sexual drive. It still remains for us to provide an overview of the various factors, internal and external, that disturb development, and indicate the places in the mechanism affected by the disturbance they cause. Let us bear in mind that the factors that are included in the same series can be of disparate value, and we are prepared to run into some difficulties in the appreciation of each of them separately. Constitution and inheritance. First of all, it is worth mentioning here the innate difference of the sexual constitution. It is probable that the main weight falls on her, but, of course, it is discernible only from her later expressions, and even then it is not with great certainty. We imagine it as the predominance of this or that of the multiple sources of sexual arousal, and we assume that this difference between the dispositions has to be expressed in some way in the final result, even if it remains within the borders of the normal. Certainly, variants of the original arrangement are also conceivable which necessarily, and without further help, lead to the formation of an abnormal sexual life. You can call them degenerative, and considered as an expression of an inherited defect. In this connection I can report a remarkable fact. In more than half the cases of hysteria, obsessional neurosis, etc., that I had under psychotherapeutic treatment, I was able to prove that the father had suffered from syphilis before marriage, whether it consisted of TABS or progressive paralysis, or could be established in some other way by way of history. I expressly state that later neurotic children did not show any bodily sign of hereditary Lewy, so that precisely their abnormal sexual constitution should be considered the ultimate sequel of their Lewedic inheritance. I am far from supposing that the offspring of syphilitic parents is the regular or inevitable etiological condition of the neuropathic constitution. However, I do not believe that the coincidence observed by me is the result of chance or irrelevant. The hereditary conditions of positive perverts are less well known, because they often elude inquiry. However, there is a basis for assuming that something similar to what occurs in neuroses is valid in perversions. Indeed, it is not uncommon to find in the same family perversion and psychoneuroses distributed like this between the sexes. The male members, or one of them, are positive perverts, but the female members, according to the proclivity of their sex to repression, they are negative, hysterical perverts. This is a good proof of the co-belonging that we have discovered between both disturbances. Further processing. On the other hand, the point of view that the conformation of sexual life would be univocally determined by the initial statement of the various components in the sexual constitution cannot be sustained. Rather, the conditioning process continues, and further possibilities depend on the fate experienced by the tributaries of sexuality emanating from each of the sources. It is evident that this further processing ultimately decides, in fact, a constitution that is identical in descriptive terms can be led by it to three different final outcomes. 1. When all the dispositions are maintained in their relative proportion, considered abnormal, and are reinforced with maturation, the final result cannot be other than a perverse sexual life. A proper analysis of these abnormal constitutional provisions has not yet been addressed. However, we already know cases that are easily explained by hypotheses of this kind. For example, about a whole series of perversions by fixation CFP 129, the authors believe that they would have as a necessary premise an innate weakness of the sexual drive. Expressed in this way, such a conception seems to me untenable, but it makes full sense if one alludes to a constitutional weakness of a factor of the sexual drive, the genital area, an area that later takes on the function of synthesizing the various sexual practices for the goal of reproduction. Then this synthesis, required at puberty, cannot but fail, and the strongest among the other components of sexuality will impose its practice as perversion. Repression. Another is the outcome when in the course of development some components, which were hyper-intense in the disposition, suffer the process of repression. As for this, we have to establish that it is not equivalent to a deletion of Hebung. The corresponding excitations continue to be produced as before, but a psychic hindrance prevents them from reaching their goal and pushes them along other paths, until they manage to express themselves as symptoms. The result can be close to normal sexual life, almost always restricted in such cases but complemented by a psychoneurotic pathology. These are precisely the cases that we know well from the psychoanalytic exploration of neurotics. The sexual life of these people has begun as that of the perverts. A whole section of his childhood is filled with perverse sexual activity, sometimes continuing well into manhood. Later, due to internal causes, a repressive turn is produced almost always before puberty, but in some cases after and from then on, without the old impulses being extinguished, neurosis replaces the perversion. Remember the proverb, a harlot when young, a prude when old, only here youth has been very brief. This relief of perversion by neurosis in the life of the same person must be coordinated, as well as the aforementioned distribution of perversion and neurosis among various members of the same family, with the understanding that neurosis is the negative of the perversion. Sublimation. The third outcome of an abnormal constitutional provision is made possible by the process of sublimation. In it, to the hyper-intense excitements that they come from the various sources of sexuality, they are drained and used in other fields, so that the result of the dangerous disposition itself is a not inconsiderable increase in the capacity for psychic performance. Here one of the sources must be discerned. Of artistic activity, and depending on whether the sublimation has been complete or incomplete, the analysis of the character of highly gifted persons, particularly those of artistic disposition, will reveal the mixture in different proportions of performance capacity, perversion, and neurosis. Sublimation is perhaps suffocation by reaction formation, which, as we have discovered, begins already in the latency period of the child, and in favorable cases continues throughout life. What we call the character of a man is built on much of it with the material of sexual arousal, and is made up of drives fixed from childhood, others acquired by sublimation, and constructions intended to curb some perverse motions, recognized as inapplicable. Thus, in the universally perverse sexual disposition of childhood, the source of a series of our virtues can be seen, to the extent that, via reaction formation, it gives the impulse to create them. The accidentally experienced. Compared with sexual debauchery, repressive waves, and sublimations, the latter two processes whose internal conditions we are completely ignorant of, all the other influences seem much less important. Whoever includes repressions and sublimations in the constitutional provision and considers them as vital manifestations of this, will undoubtedly have the right to affirm that the definitive conformation of sexual life is above all the result of the innate constitution. But no one with any insight will doubt that in this cooperation of factors there is also room for the modifying influences of what was accidentally experienced in childhood and later. It is not easy to appreciate in their reciprocal proportion the effectiveness of constitutional and accidental factors. In theory there is always a tendency to overestimate the former, Therapeutic practice highlights the importance of the latter. In no case should it be forgotten that there is a relationship of cooperation and not of exclusion between the two. The constitutional factor has to wait for certain experiences to put it into effect, the accidental needs to be anchored in the constitution to become effective. In most cases it is possible to imagine a complementary series, 14 as it is called, in which the decreasing intensities of one factor are offset by the increasing intensities of the other, but there is no ground for denying the existence of extreme cases in the ends of the series. What is most consistent with psychoanalytic research is to attribute a preferential position among accidental factors to early childhood experiences. The unique etiological series is broken down, then, into two, which can be called the predispositional and the definitive. In the first, constitution and accidental childhood experiences cooperate as they do in the second, predisposition and subsequent traumatic experiences. All deteriorating factors of sexual development externalize their effect in the following way: they cause a regression, a return to an earlier stage of development. Now we will continue our task, which is to review the factors whose influence on sexual development we have come to know, whether they constitute effective powers or mere externalizations of them. Precocity. A factor of this kind is spontaneous sexual precocity, which can be verified with certainty at least in the etiology of the neuroses, although, like the other factors, it is not by itself a sufficient cause. It manifests itself in the interruption, shortening or elimination of the infantile latency period, and it becomes the cause of disturbances insofar as it causes sexual expressions which, due to the incompleteness of sexual inhibitions, on the one hand, and on the other, the lack of development of the genital system, on the other, can only present itself as perversions. Now these inclinations to perversion can be preserved as such, or become drive forces of neurotic symptoms after repression. In all cases, sexual precocity hinders the desirable subsequent control of the sexual drive by the higher psychic instances, and increases the compulsive character that the psychic subrogations of the drive demand. Sexual precocity usually goes hand in hand with early intellectual development. Thus, we find it in the childhood history of the most prominent and productive individuals. In such cases it does not seem to have the same pathogenic effects as when it occurs in isolation. Temporary factors. Other factors must also be taken into account which, along with precocity, can be grouped under the heading of temporary. The sequence in which the various instinctual motions are activated, and the period during which they can be externalized until they suffer the influence of another instinctual motion that has just emerged or of a typical repression, seem phylogenetically established. But both in that temporal sequence and in the respective periods there seem to be variations that, in an ineluctable way, have a decisive influence on the final result. It is not indistinct whether a certain current emerges before or after its opposite current, since the effect of a repression cannot be undone. A temporary imbalance in the composition of the elements produces, as a general rule, an alteration of the result. On the other hand, instinctual movements that emerge with particular intensity often have an astonishingly short course. For example, the heterosexual bond of those who will later become manifest homosexuals. The fact that in childhood certain aspirations are installed with the greatest violence does not justify the fear that they will govern the character of the adult for a long time. It is equally licit to hope that they will disappear to make room for their opponents. Tyrants reign a short time. We cannot even indicate the origin of these temporary complications of development processes. Here, the panorama opens up to us on a phalanx of deeper biological, and perhaps also historical, problems, with which we cannot fight, because we have not even come close enough to them. Adhesion. The significance of all premature sexual expressions is increased by a psychological factor of unknown origin, which for now we have to admit as a mere psychological provisionality. I refer to the high adhesiveness Haft-Barkett or fixability. Fixier-Barkett that must necessarily be assumed in those who later become neurotic, as well as in perverts, to complete the constellation of facts, since, in other people, identical premature sexual expressions do not imprint themselves so durably as to provoke their repetition compulsive and prescribe the pathways of the sexual drive for life. Perhaps this adhesiveness will become clear in part if we pay attention to another psychic factor that we cannot fail to count in the causation of neuroses, namely, the greater weight that memory traces have in mental life compared to recent impressions. It is evident that this factor depends on the intellectual formation and grows as the personal culture increases. In opposition to this, the savage has been characterized as the unhappy son of the moment. By virtue of the existing link of opposition between culture and the free development of sexuality, the consequences of which can be traced very deeply in the conformation of our life, the importance that the way in which sexuality has developed has for later life of the child is very low in the lower stages of culture and society, and very high in the higher ones. Fixation. However, the propitious ground created by the psychic factors that we have just mentioned is taken advantage of by the accidentally experienced incitements of infantile sexuality. These, seduction by other children or by adults, above all, provide the material that, with the help of those factors, can be fixed as a permanent disturbance. A good part of the deviations from the normal sexual life that are later observed have been established from the beginning, both in neurotics and in perverts, by the impressions of the infantile period, supposedly devoid of sexuality. In the causation, the solicitation and gegenkommen of the constitution, precocity, the property of high adhesiveness, and the contingent incitement of the sexual drive by a foreign influence cooperate. However, these inquiries about the disturbances of the sexual life have borne unsatisfactory fruit. This is due to the fact that we do not know enough about the biological processes in which the essence of sexuality consists to form, from our isolated insights, a theory that is sufficient to understand both the normal and the pathological. End. The Metamorphosis of Freedom. Sigmund Freud.